John F. Kennedy is often remembered as one of the most popular American presidents of all time, but his life was cut all too short when he was assassinated in 1963. We've learned a lot about JFK in the decades since his death. Here's how it all changes the historical narrative. On January 20th, 1961, Kennedy kicked off his presidency with a masterful speech. His inaugural address possessed a powerful balance of hope and foreboding, as it issued warnings to America's potential enemies and urged allies across the globe to band together against the common enemies of man. Then came a quote for the ages.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Kennedy saw greatness on the horizon, and he needed his fellow Americans to join him. But it turns out that the iconic quote might have been inspired by an important figure from JFK's past. A notebook was discovered in 2011 that belonged to George St. John, former headmaster of the Choate School in Connecticut. A teenage JFK sat through St. John's sermons, and the headmaster's notes included this familiar-sounding quote from Harvard Dean LeBaron Briggs. The youth who loves his alma mater will always ask, not what can she do for me, but what can I do for her? Even before Briggs's quote came to light, historian Thurston Clark pointed out in a 2004 book about Kennedy's inauguration that St. John was known to say, "It's not what Choate does for you, but what you can do for Choate." Inga Arvid was a journalist and beauty queen in her native Denmark, but to JFK she was Inga Binga, and he was her Boston Bean. According to Kennedy scholar Nigel Hamilton, Arvid was the great love of Kennedy's life. When Arvid first met the future president in 1941, she was married to one of the world's richest men. 4 years older than Kennedy, Arvid acted as a sort of mentor. She critiqued his writing, dispensed political advice, and gave very hands-on lessons about the birds and the bees. Unfortunately, Adolf Hitler also enjoyed knowing her. Arvid had interviewed Hitler, who called her, quote, a perfect example of Nordic beauty. She was extremely chummy with the German Führer, and her husband may have been a Nazi agent. Suspecting that Arvid was a spy, FBI agents kept a close watch on her. They even eavesdropped on her pillow talk with JFK. Kennedy's father understandably didn't want him sleeping with a possible enemy, so he put a stop to the romance. For decades, Americans have perceived the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was dramatized in the 2000 film 13 Days, as a game of apocalyptic chicken that started when an unprovoked Soviet Union placed nuclear weapons in Cuba. Luckily, JFK had the fortitude and prudence needed to prevent an apocalyptic calamity. He made the Soviets back down with nary a concession by America.
That a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island.
But it turns out that that entire narrative is rather misleading. Since 1997, scholars have had access to recordings that Kennedy secretly made of meetings with his top advisors, and they've been trying to set the record straight since then. The truth is that JFK inflamed the Cold War by placing missiles in Turkey and Italy, uncomfortably close to the Soviets. American plots to take out Cuban leader Fidel Castro further stoked hostilities. The communists responded with ominous posturing, but Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev knew that the U.S. had a much larger arsenal. And even though Kennedy spread the lie that the U.S. forced the Soviets to unilaterally remove their missiles, JFK withdrew American missiles as well. However, he threatened to scrap the arrangement if the Soviets disclosed that fact. People often associate JFK with vim and vigor, but they probably don't think of another V word, vomiting. That's one of the many symptoms associated with an adrenal disorder called Addison's disease. That was one of the multiple ailments that Kennedy grappled with throughout his life while projecting an image of physical robustness to the public.
He was so ill that his father had put cortisone treatments in safe deposit boxes around the country if he ever needed them because of his Addison's disease.
Kennedy spent much of his presidency in physical misery due to severe back trouble and Addison's, which in addition to the vomiting causes infections, fatigue, joint and muscle pain, depression, skin discoloration, and various abdominal problems. With the help of his family, JFK mostly hid his ailing health. However, political rivals caught wind of his condition and tried to expose him. During the 1960 presidential race, Democratic hopeful and JFK's future running mate Lyndon B. Johnson told the press via his aides that JFK had Addison's disease, but the revelation was dismissed as a smear. Also, during that year's general election, Richard Nixon supposedly orchestrated a Watergate-style break-in to obtain JFK's medical records, though he failed. Well before Kennedy became president, the United States had become involved in the Vietnam War. But it wasn't until the Gulf of Tonkin incident of 1964 that America opted to wage a full-tilt military campaign against North Vietnam. Had Kennedy still been president then, that escalation may never have happened. Pentagon documents that became declassified in 1997 revealed that in October 1963, JFK ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 military personnel from Vietnam by the end of the year. Publicly, Kennedy called withdrawal, quote, a deep mistake. But behind closed doors, he rejected the Joint Chiefs of Staff's advice to take overt action and instead instructed them to take decidedly less action by leaving. Roughly a month after JFK's withdrawal order, the South Vietnamese president, who had fallen out of favor with the U.S. military, was assassinated. JFK was killed 3 weeks later, and when Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency, he bolstered both military and CIA operations almost immediately. Experts disagree on whether Kennedy would have followed through with the exit plan, but according to Johnson's former deputy national security advisor, Kennedy planned to have most U.S. forces out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.